Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 17th of September of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to start from Kherson direction. Today the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of clashes, bombings and many other types of operations, the Ukrainians lost 20 soldiers and 3 armored vehicles. Of course, the number of losses is completely less in comparison with the previous days. For example, on the 15th of September, the level of loss was around 75 soldiers and so on. And this is a very important thing and very important situation. As we can see, the Russians are completely focused on this bank of Dnieper River. They're using all types of weapon they have, FPV drones, FAB bombings and so on. And the question is why the Russians are continue attacking in this direction, continue bombing, because the Ukrainians currently do have some progress in the vicinity of Orekhov, in the vicinity of Vremivka tactical bridgehead and so on. And of course we understand that probably, most likely, the usage of FAB bombings would be much better and bring the Ukrainians more results and better situation in these directions in comparison with the bombings along Dnieper River. So that means that if Orekhov direction and Vremivka direction are not so important for, let's say, air bombings in comparison with Dnieper River, that means that Ukrainians have created something or have some plans regarding this territory. If we increase the number of updates since the beginning of September for another time, we see how the Russians were focused during the previous months. At least few explosions in Berislav, at least 10 explosions in Kazatska Vesyola, few explosions in the settlement Mykolaiivka, a lot of explosions in the settlement by the name of Lvova. The only explanation I have is that Ukrainians have accumulated significant number of forces in this direction, and their main plans and the main goals of the Ukrainians is to force the Russians or to redeploy some strategical reserves in this direction, which will ease the Ukrainian situation in Orekhov and Vremivka tactical bridgehead. And another purpose is, of course, if the Russians are not able to redeploy forces, to force the Russians to use air forces like FAB carriers and so on. And as we can see, according to all these geolocations, we understand that the Ukrainians managed to complete this mission. They forced the Russians to concentrate their air forces in this direction because probably the Russians don't have any other option. Now we're moving to Orekhov direction, and today we got a lot of interesting updates and details. We have already discussed in the previous video about the Russian FPV drone superiority. Today we continue receiving more updates, more videos about the clashes, but as you can see, there are no changes on the ground. The Ukrainians from their side continue accumulation and concentration of their forces in the fields between Verbovo and Rabotina for the further offensive operation, which they haven't started yet. Probably they're going to start these attacks the next week. They need a few days, some operational pause for regrouping and so on. And one more time, the question is why the Russians are not using FAB bombings in this direction. It's very difficult to understand whether the Ukrainian attacks have all this progress, has some problems for the Russians, has some danger for the Russian defense belt. I don't know, but as I understand, if the Russians were able to use FAB bombings to attack Orekhov and Malotokmachka, of course, they would ease the entire situation of Russian forces, because you know that there are a lot of forces in this Rabotina salient on the Bradley Square. As we discussed, there is 82nd Brigade, 71st Brigade, it's 46th Brigade, 65th Brigade, there is 116th, 117th and 118th, significant number of forces, and we need to understand that there is just one way how the Ukrainians do have possibilities to move and redeploy their forces, and this is the railways. So there is no other way. You can't move all these forces through fields because it's too long and too expensive. It's unlogical. But the only way is to use railways and railway stations. And the question is why the Russians are not using FAB bombings as they used to use in June and May. And as we can see, one more time, the Dnieper River is more dangerous for the Russians in comparison with the entire situation in Orekhov. And this is very interesting. I expect some intensifying of actions from the Ukrainian side in the very, very near future along the entire Dnieper River. As a result of clashes in the Zaporozhye direction, the Russians reported that Ukrainians lost another 140 soldiers, 5 armored vehicles, including 1 Bradley, and 3 artillery systems. Now we are moving further to the Vremivka tactical bridgehead, and today we got not many updates as we had previous days, but we got at least 2 very interesting icons that we need to discuss. Obviously, today I was very surprised, was very interested by the one video that was published by the Russian sources. On this video you can see how the Ukrainians launched a small offensive operation using light vehicles. On this video you can see destroyed Ukrainian tanks that probably the Ukrainians were using to attack during the first days of a direction of attack in direction of Novodonetsk, Kremenchuk, when the Ukrainians tried to cut this main supply road that goes from Kremenchuk to Novodonetsk. That attack was repelled. The Ukrainians, as you can see, had significant losses. The entire through lines was under very heavy fire and destroyed. And as you can see on this video, the Ukrainians made a very interesting operation just for one purpose: to evacuate dead soldiers, dead bodies. And this is very interesting because the question is that probably somebody very important died in those 3 lines, so the Ukrainians were forced to create the entire evacuation mission with a lot of infantry for these purposes. This video that impressed me because it's very interesting who was in those 3 lines that Ukrainians took a decision to create such a big and very dangerous evacuation mission. So no changes on the ground. The Russians saved control over Novodonetsk and Novomayorsk, and probably the Russians have restored control over the northwestern part of Novomayorsk. We haven't received any video confirmation of that, but I believe that something like this is already currently happening or will happen in the very near future. Very interesting update we got from Staromayorsk. As you can see, the Ukrainians, after they were defeated Novodonetsk and Novomayorsk, and that probably was a very heavy defeat, haven't managed to restore their power or currently try to do this. And the Russian sources reported, at least Rybary, the Russian military expert, reported that the Russians launched a small counter-offensive operation, or probably reconnaissance, that was reconnaissance in force or reconnaissance in combat, that ended very successfully. And as a result of that attack, the Russians managed to return control over some part of Urozhaine, and so they entered with soldiers and country controlled the southwestern part. The Ukrainians made few counteroffensives from Urozhaine, but all those attempts were repelled. The Ukrainians were defeated, and we'll follow the situation, because if it's true, of course, the Russians will try to develop this situation, and they will try to return control first over Staromayorsk and after that over Urozhaine, and this can lead to entire collapse of Ukrainian plans and the entire situation. The Ministry of Defense reported that as a result of clashes on South Donetsk direction, the Ukrainians lost 170 soldiers and 7 armored vehicles. And also the Russians reported that the forces of 35th Marine Brigade almost lost its also combat capabilities. Yesterday we discussed that already 82nd Brigade and 25th Brigade lost already, and probably the Ukrainians have already started redeployment of these forces to the mainland for restoring, and another brigade from Vremivka tactical bridgehead also lost its combat capabilities. Now we are moving further to Donetsk direction, and today we got a lot of updates. The Russians continue bombing and destroying, reducing till ruins the settlement by the name of Novomikhailivka. They published another video how, as a result of missile strike, they managed to destroy another operational ammo depot that was located in the western part of the settlement. So one more time, the Russians attacking this area heavily. They do have some problems, the Russians, in the vicinity of the stronghold Zverinets, and they are make some plans to counterattack, and I do expect fact that very soon the Russians will start acting and will intensify their actions in the vicinity of the settlement. Also, the Russians made few attacks with FPV drones against the Ukrainian positions in Krasnogorovka. Very interesting videos because I had a lot of questions regarding the combat line and the situation in this area. Today the Russians published the videos, and on this video we can see how the 2 destroyed Russian tanks on the bottom of the screen. That was like failed Russian attempt to attack along the railways. That attack probably was repelled by the Ukrainians. The Russians had some losses, and currently the Russians try to suppress and to reduce the Ukrainian shelter along the railways before the next wave of attack in direction of Krasnogorovka. And now we're coming to the most interesting, the most probably covered with fog of war area, to Bakhmut, Artyomovsk. Today we're going to talk about Andriivka, Klishchiivka, and many other settlements and the entire situation. First of all, the most important update is that the Ukrainians, as a result of offensive operation, very first clashes, managed to establish control over Andriivka. That was a very heavy and very difficult battle for the Ukrainians. They made few attempts, around 10 attempts to storm the settlement from different sides, but the last thing that broke the entire situation were 2 flanks attacks. One of those attacks took place on the north, and as a result of that attack the Ukrainians managed to establish control over the railways on the north, and the second one on the south. Basically the Ukrainians managed to encircle and establish operational encirclement of the settlement and maybe even a cauldron. The Russians did have possibility to support their forces using just the underground facilities, and for now we had at least 3 geolocated videos. The only difference and the only important thing that most of the geolocations took part in the western part of the settlement. That means that probably the eastern part or a few buildings and streets still remains in the gray zone or under Russian control. So at least this area I will not color in yellow, because we haven't received even a single confirmation of Ukrainian presence present in this sector of the settlement. Now we are moving to Klishchiivka, and today the Ukrainian sources also confirmed or reported that they managed to establish full control over the settlement. They published the video in the vicinity of the church that located in the central part, the storm assault squad brigade Lut with other Ukrainian forces. The only important thing that we need to discuss about this situation is that also the same situation as with Andriivka. The Ukrainians still haven't published even a single video, geolocated video, that they have established control over the northeastern part of the settlement along the railways. Furthermore, the Ukrainians haven't published even a single confirmation of control over this strait of the settlement. So for now I will keep this map, as you can see, this just 2 sectors of Klishchiivka I will keep under red color, which means that probably these 3 streets are under Russian control. The Russians from their side published the video how they were bombing and attacking Klishchiivka, the edge Ukrainian positions, with all types of artillery systems they have, including Grad systems and TOS flamethrower systems, which confirms the Ukrainian presence at least on the east of this water reservoir. And another geolocated video from the Russian side, how the Ukrainians were trying to move along these streets, along these ruins, and the Russians controlled the entire situation, and they were bombing and attacking the Ukrainians who were moving from one building to another. These are Ukrainian soldiers, and they were trying to move further to the south. And as you can see, this is another confirmation of the edge positions, and that part of the settlement that located along the railways is still under Russian control. Furthermore, the Russian sources published another video. The Russian soldier published the video how the Ukrainians were attacking the main Russian supply road with cluster rounds. This area the Russians were using or are using still to supply and support to rotate troopers inside of a settlement by the name of Klishchiivka. And what is very important regarding this video, the author of this video is Russian, and he was making this video from let's add with like with color, from this area. So basically this video confirms at least two things. The first thing is that the Russians still in this location, so they control this forest line that located on the north of Klishchiivka, and from these positions he was making a video of how the Ukrainians were bombing with cluster rounds the main supply road. A lot of this video was very informative. The Ukrainians from their side established full FPV drone control over the main supply road between Klishchiivka and Artyomovsk, not just with cluster rounds. Also, there are a lot of FPV drones who are flying above this road and attacking the Russian forces, the Russian soldiers, the Russian armored vehicles, the Russian supply machines. So the situation is critical. I'm not saying that that the Ukrainians are not able to capture. I believe it's the question not of whether the Ukrainians are able to capture not the Klishchiivka completely, but the question of time. When exactly is this is going to happen? And I believe that maybe 2 to 3 days, and the Russians will leave, will be forced to leave from the western part or from the western side of the railways, but not from Kurdyumovka, Zelenopolya. This is still the settlements on this side of the bridgehead of the railways, and the Ukrainians still needs a lot of things to do to complete the clearing and the storming of these two settlements. From the Russian side, we got a lot of videos of their complete FPV drone superiority in Ivanovska. That was a very important mission during the battle for Klishchiivka and Andriivka, because without complete FPV drone superiority about Ivanovska, of course the Ukrainians would capture Andriivka and Klishchiivka much earlier, maybe even in July. But because of that fact that the entire settlement, the main logistic area that Ukrainians used to redeploy forces from north to the south, from east to the west, from west to the east, was under complete fire. We had significant number of geolocated confirmations from this territory. So this is just Ivanovska for the period from August till 17th of September. Significant number of FPV drone strikes without any Ukrainian counter drone duels or counter artillery duels. So, but one more time, the battle for Klishchiivka was finished today, and the battle for Andriivka as well. It's just a question of time when the Russians will completely leave this sector. Now we are moving to the north, and today we got a lot of interesting updates as well. If you remember, just a few days ago, those days we discussed about the next steps of the Ukrainians, and I told you that I don't think that the Ukrainians are going to cross the railways and attack the Russians in direction of Oputne, Kadema, because basically they don't have forces for this, and the crossing of the railways is too difficult operation. But the Ukrainians do have possibilities to attack the Russians in the line Dubovo-Vasilievka, Zaliznyanskaya. And the previous weeks they have already launched few offensives with the 30th Mechanized Brigade, with currently that video was published by the forces of Ichkerian Battalion Sheikh Mansour and so on. And now this is the primary objective for the Ukrainians, to force the Russians to leave the western bridgehead of the railways as well from Siversk to Bakhmut, and to move to force the Russians to move in direction of Solidar, Podgorodny and so on. I believe that the Russians are going to fight for this area very heavily, and the Ukrainians lost a lot of blood on the south, and the Russians also understand that the Ukrainians are not endless, and I believe that the late autumn, middle autumn and late autumn campaign is going to be under the flag of battle for the northern Bakhmut bridgehead, and this is the main objective for the Ukrainians before winter comes. But there are a lot of problems for the Ukrainians. Before the problems, one more time, the Russians reported that as a result of clashes on the Donetsk direction, the Ukrainians lost 180 soldiers, 4 armored vehicles and 2 artillery systems. Now let's talk about the Ukrainian problems, and they're very big, by the way. If you have access to, let's say, to the western deployment map, and if you follow the deployment of Ukrainian forces, you would mention that the Siversk direction used to be under protection of a lot of very interesting brigades. For example, since the beginning of this configuration of the front line, Siversk has been protected by 81st Air Mobile Brigade, by the 54th Mechanized Brigade, and of course 10th Mountain Assault Brigade. And before the Russians launched their offensive operation in Kupiansk direction, there were another two important and very powerful brigades. The first one is 30th Mechanized Brigade, and the second one is 115th Mechanized Brigade. But after the Russians launched their offensive operation in Kupiansk direction, the Ukrainians had they had some options to choose. They understand that they need to use some forces from some brigades from some direction and to redeploy them to the Kupiansk. And the Ukrainians had few options. First option was to use some forces from Orekhov or Vremevka and to redeploy them to Kupiansk. But these two directions are very far from Kupiansk, and the Ukrainians basically didn't have this time, and they needed some progress in this direction because these are NATO brigades and there was a plan and there were no possibility to redeploy these forces to the north. The third direction that the Ukrainians had is the battle for Klishchiivka and Andriivka, and the Ukrainians also could use something like 92nd Brigade, 60th Mechanized, 5th, 80th, 3rd or Lut or 22nd. So there are a lot of forces, and the Ukrainians had possibility to use these forces and to redeploy them to the north. But if the Ukrainians redeployed forces from the South Bakhmut direction, of course they wouldn't be able to establish control over Andriivka and Klishchiivka. So that's why they took a decision not to touch the forces from this area, and the Ukrainians took a decision to use forces of 30th Mechanized and 115th from the northern Bakhmut direction. Currently, these two brigades located in Kupiansk area, between, let's say, Sinkovka and, of course, Novoselovska. So these two brigades were currently located in this area. And now, if we take a look at Siversk bridgehead, and if you take a look at any mapper that follow the redeployment process, we're gonna see very interesting detail, very interesting information, that currently the area from Belogorovka to, let's say, Razdolovka or Minkovka is under protection of just three powerful brigades: 81st, 54th and 10th. And this is a very dangerous and very critical situation for the Ukrainians. I'm not saying that the Russians are going to launch their own offensive operation tomorrow. For example, today we got another videos from Belogorovka direction, how the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions along the railways, using artillery shells and so on, without any progress on the ground. Probably this is just a minor video from this direction, another FPV drone strike. But if you ask my opinion, I would say that currently this is the most tasty piece of cake for the Russians currently, Siversk direction, because of complete absence of forces in this area. The closest forces on the north is 56th Brigade, 57th, and Siversk is almost unprotected. So we'll see whether the Russians are going to use these benefits, this situation, to counterattack. But I would say that if they have power to attack, they need to start doing this tomorrow. But who knows whether they have these possibilities or not. When talking about Liman direction, the Russians reported that as a result of clashes, the Ukrainians lost 65 soldiers. There are just regular artillery duels, no changes on the ground. The Ukrainians published the video how they managed to discover the Russian platoon moving along the forest, and as a result of cluster rounds, probably some of the soldiers were wounded or killed. And the Russians published the video how they discovered the Ukrainian D-20 or D-30 howitzer somewhere in the vicinity, somewhere in the Kremenaya forest in the vicinity of Yampol, and as a result of accurate artillery strike, that artillery system was destroyed. When talking about Kupiansk direction, there are no changes at all, just the changes we discussed about the redeployment of 115th and 30th Mechanized Brigade to the north. No changes on the ground, and the clashes in this area continues, and as a result of those clashes, the Ukrainians lost another 50 soldiers and nothing special. So completely stabilized front line. The Ukrainians managed to stabilize by redeploying these strategical reserves. But currently, one more time, the weakest point of Ukrainian defense is Siversk. And the question is whether the Russians are going to use this situation or not. During the previous night, the Russians made a lot of Iskander strikes, missile strikes against Kharkiv. More than 5 explosions took place in that settlement, and as a result of that attack, according to the Ministry of Defense, the Ukrainian industrial tank production plant was destroyed, and another explosion took place in Zaporozhye, also somewhere in the civilian populated area. Probably another accumulation or concentration of Ukrainian forces was discovered and destroyed. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.